Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this session, Doing It All, Nonprofit Governance and the Working Board. Today, we will talk about the many activities and duties fulfilled by a working board, the strengths and challenges of this governance structure, and how to balance governance and operational roles. My name is Sandeep, and I am the Manager of Education here at Integral Org. I will be hosting today's session, so you can get a hold of me at any time via the chat feature. For any questions, comments, concerns that come up for you, I'm here to support your participation today. On that note, with regards to accessibility needs, you can turn on the closed caption feature if that will help you out today. It's the double C icon on the Zoom toolbar. The live transcription option will help you follow along today's session, and the closed captioning feature will also be available on the video link that you will receive after today's session. I'm going to drop a little bit more about that in the chat for you now. This should help troubleshoot anything if you're having issues, but again, send me a direct message and we can work out any kinks if you're running into problems there. As always, we will have a Q&A period at the end of today's session, so please submit your questions along the way and we'll circle back to them at the end of our time together. We'll begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that Integral Org is based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. This refers to the confluence of Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is situated in the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. Mohkinstsis is also home to the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Métis Nation of Alberta District 5 and 6. At Integral Org, our team recognizes the existing tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and efforts towards truth and reconciliation. We accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. We all have a connection and responsibility to the lands that host our lives, our communities, and our work. With that, I would like to introduce our facilitator for today. I would like to welcome Mike Grogan. Mike is the president and CEO of Integral Org and has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 30 years. He is recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create sustainable solutions to organizational and community challenges. Mike is passionate about helping organizations understand the ever-evolving nonprofit landscape and working with teams to build their capacity so that they can strategically respond and adapt. Over to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Sandeep, and thank you all for taking time to chat about governance, one of my favorite topics. But I know folks are busy, and there's lots going on these days out there, so it really is a privilege to spend some time with you. And it is my hope that this is the start of a conversation. Hopefully, you will present some information for you today. But if there's questions that come up, we have a time at the end and even afterwards. I think we budgeted 75 minutes. I don't think we probably go that long. If you want to hang around and just put your camera on, have a conversation about specific issues that we don't get to, we're always want to do that. And if that doesn't work for you, certainly we're open to talk anytime. So you can certainly book a time just to chat with us about anything. But this is what we do. Our job as Integral Org is to come alongside you wherever you're at in the lifespan of a nonprofit and help you with your governance, your strategy, or legal or leadership needs. So our job is to help you do your job better. And it's a privilege to do that. Today, we're going to talk about this idea of the working board, which the terminology we'll get into in a minute or two here, but just boards that work with little or no paid staff. And we'll talk some context around that, about why they are so important, I think, why we probably have not developed enough materials, I think, and supports and resources for this very large and very important group. So we'll go through kind of a landscape of the Alberta question, what's happening out there, what the structure of the sector is, really just briefly on that kind of stuff. We'll talk about working boards, just some clarity, maybe some insights on how you might want to sort of boost any board up. It's totally sort of structure that toward maybe the board that doesn't have staff. We'll leave you, as always, with resources and tools. And again, any questions you have, by all means, pop in the chat. There'll be some chances for you to answer some other things here, but this is a session for you. We'll record this, the recording and all that stuff's available afterwards. But again, I hope it's the beginning of a conversation, not just a one-off here. So to get us started, we're going to do a poll. So Sandeep, Sandeep will pop this up here for us, I believe, just to get a bit of a survey of who's in here. So your experience right now, who's on a governing board. Maybe you have a senior executive. Maybe I apparently don't need my comments because you're filling it anyway. Working board, no staff, or maybe a working board that has an administrative staff. So just maybe a few answers there, and we will see what we get and who's in the room here. So.
We have some responses coming in. I'll
Yeah,
let
they're
it
flying in.
run for a
There's
second
31
here.
so far. I'm not sure how big the group is today. We always sort of think about who's going to show up to these things. 140 folks registered. I think we'll probably get 40-ish or so coming today. Let's end it there, I think. And can you share it, share results?
Yep.
I believe it's shared. So a fairly even break. Lots of folks who have no staff and some who do. So I hope there's value in all this, and recognizing that we probably, as folks go through life in terms of community engagement. Oh, share results. Turn it off. There we go. Don't leave Mike in front of technology. That's probably the lesson we learned there. We don't just stay with one kind of board. If you're on a board right now, I'm on 2 or 3 boards here and there, and sometimes you have a ED, and sometimes you go back to or into a different realm where you have no staff. So we'll cover some things. A lot of things are very fundamental to board governance. So this all doesn't just fit with that working board model. This is a definition we use, and this is from these Certified Professional Accountants of Canada. If you want great information that's Canadian-made on governance, the Professional Accounts of Canada has a free library of services, kind of overview of board roles and responsibilities, written in plain language, updated really frequently, which is really nice because sometimes you get stuff and it's years old and it doesn't quite fit the jurisdictional pieces. You got to sort of think you're in Alberta. Sometimes there's things that may not quite align. The accountants are really good resources. So this is their definition, and this is one, no matter what size board you have, the board is responsible for all aspects of the organization. They have a comma, you can put a period there. You are the legal authority for the organization. You may have a membership that puts you there, but that's sort of the buck stops at the board of directors. What happens after that is where it gets challenging, perhaps, or maybe there's different nuance, maybe not so much a challenge. So you oversee the operations, and how we do that is whether you have a manager, a senior executive do that, or the board's responsible for that themselves. So that's the legal definition, so the legal construct, or the technical construct, perhaps more, for what a board does. And you're there to deliver on the mission. It's how you do it. Perhaps a little more nuanced way is that this is one we use quite often in our board development workshops when we're looking at individual boards or this kind of sessions, is that boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. And I do like that line in the sense that nonprofit boards are not quite like anything else. This isn't like a business. It's not like a family. It's not like a team in some sense. It is that you're kind of put together with folks that have a similar passion, but not necessarily fully aligned. When we talk with boards, you think, well, why are you here? Why are you on a board? A lot of times they overlap, but they're not always the same. So you're in this kind of weird, kind of 3-legged race with other people where you can only move as a collective. And that is the other concept of governance. Again, no matter the size of the board or the structure of the board, you have significant power. I would say almost all power, but can act only as a collective. No individual board member can enact anything independently. And that is, I think, when it works well, the magic of a board is you have to make decisions collectively. It's also where it falls apart. When you start to pull that concept apart a bit and people start sort of heading down different directions on their own. So we'll spend a lot of time with boards. We'll spend some time a day talking about roles and responsibilities and clarity and teamwork and all those things that make a really good functioning board of any size. So it's not necessarily easy work. When it works well, it's great. When it doesn't, which is for all of us, we go through ups and downs like any organization or any team or any family or any relationship. Boards are going to go through ups and downs. So it is something, no matter how big or small you are, it needs to be attended to. And that idea of board self-governance, that board taking care of its own house, is something we're probably all not very good at. We love to do the work. We love to sort of do the planning, maybe the fundraising, maybe the hands-on work, but sort of taking care of us as governors, that's a little more challenging sometimes, perhaps. Just to set a bit of the context. Over 27,000 nonprofits incorporated in Alberta, operating in Alberta. I think it's probably a fair bit more than that, to tell you the truth. That's a bit light. This would be roughly the number who are actually incorporated here, but there are groups that are not incorporated in Alberta who operate here as well. So it's a really busy place. If you think that's a lot of nonprofits, that's because that's a lot of nonprofits. You know, not great stats to back this up, and we can't compare as well on data on the nonprofit sector. But arguably, we have as many or more nonprofits per capita than anywhere else, probably in the Western world. There's lots of reasons for that. Perhaps it's easy to start a nonprofit, but every year, about 1,200 new nonprofits join the mix. And that's a lot of nonprofits. When you think about the number of board members and the resources that might go into it, there's not necessarily enough to support that many. So after about maybe 5 years, a third of those are perhaps gone. After about 10 years, maybe half of those are gone. So easy to start, a really crowded space. And so when we think about this, you think about there's probably not a lot of unique organizations. There's not 27,000 different causes out there, maybe different in different geographic regions, but there's probably somebody like you somewhere. It's a lot of competition for bandwidth. There's not like the public's going to say, I'm going to look at 27,000 different asks and say, I'm going to give you money. So it is a crowded space, but it's also a really rich space. It gives us a sense of an ability to meet needs in really different ways and unique ways. And I love that there's 1,200 new nonprofits every year, because how else do things change? How else? And the idea that people would sort of step up and say, I'm going to start something to better community. That is a great thing. We need to encourage those things. But what we also need to do is make sure we be a little more sustainable. So we're not starting folks out and then shutting them down a couple of years later. 57% of nonprofits have no paid staff. So that's pretty standard, and that's been that way for decades. Is that we may have a lot of nonprofits, but the majority of them, almost 2/3 perhaps, don't have any paid staff. They are strictly run by volunteers. Going with that, about 80% of nonprofits have budgets of less than $250,000, and some significantly less than that, under 100,000. So those are the groups that likely do not have a senior executive. Those are the groups that probably quite likely are working as a working board. One of the questions we got in the the registration questions, we asked if you had questions for us. One of the comments that came up was, is the risk level for board members higher during these interesting times? Interesting in quotations. I'm going to assume that interesting is not just about the coming of spring and the melting of the snow, that maybe it's more to do with global economic meltdowns and such things, but I'm going to go that route. And so the answer is obviously yes. I mean, no matter, again, if you're a small board not only, but working in a sort of very smaller area, niche area, or you're a large board of a big nonprofit, it doesn't matter. This is a time to attend to your own risks and perhaps vulnerabilities. So as we do, I'm an economist by background, so you tend to sort of see things in kind of the dismal kind of way, I think. But it's a challenge. It'll be a challenging year for nonprofits. When we think about what's happening to markets, and that's just one indicator, that probably means less funding. That means less funding from donors, individual donors, as their own situations change. It will challenge government revenues at all levels. It will challenge foundations and endowments go down, and will create a lot more need. So this is a time for any nonprofit sort of step back from maybe perhaps the normal way of working, whatever that might mean, to say, we need to take a bit of stock here. What's it going to look like in 3, 6, 8 months? And it's hard to plan that far out. When we do strategic planning work with organizations, one of the rules of thumbs that we put out there is that, as uncertainty grows, the length of your planning horizon shrinks. So right now, we may be looking at 6 months to 1 year plans to say, we just don't know what's going to happen out there. And it doesn't hurt to have those conversations. So if your board is sort of starting to think, okay, what's the world going to look like and how it's going to impact us? And it may impact you as board members, that people will just not have time to volunteer. It's one of those things that we see changing over time here, is that volunteerism is dropping off as well. That's what happened during COVID, has not come back to the levels it was. And whether it's even on that track to come back, that's right phraseology, I'm not sure. So volunteerism is under pressure. And especially in the board level, I think getting people to be on boards is a tougher and tougher thing to do. So the landscape, it's there. There's a richness to it. There's some challenges coming up, but there'll always be challenges coming up to it. So for us, it's as boards think, okay, what does this mean for us, and what steps do we need to take? Alrighty, let's get into the working board. I want you to chat. If you can do this in the chat for me, just think about governance. Where you sit in the board, again, doesn't matter what kind of board you are. But in the chat, answer a question. What works well with the current model of nonprofit governance? Where are we really rocking it? What do you think this is a good thing about our model? Conversely, though, and I'll try to make a distinction between these two because it is popping up in the chat, but what's not working well? Share some thoughts with us, and we'll see if we can play with those or not. But just think about it for a second. What's really working well with nonprofit governance in your point of view, your opinion? Just whatever it is, there's no right or wrong answer here. And where does it fall a little bit short, perhaps? Throw some answers in the chat. Let's see what we come up with here, and then we'll go. Yeah, lots of good resources out there. Yeah, there is. I mean, this is an area where there is lots of great stuff out there. That's for sure. And if you're ever thinking, where do I find stuff? That's where we can actually help you. Nimble, flexible. If most people don't know what governance truly is, I think that's true. The idea, or we all think we know what governance is, but it's a team game, right? To say I might have one view of governance, you have a different one. So that is that collective understanding, that common understanding. Diverse perspectives, fantastic. Government accountability rules, fantastic. Getting constituent contributions from board members, yeah, and it's the reality. I think the idea that when we're on boards, even myself, I'm on a board, and you think sometimes I really respond to emails quickly or do what I'm supposed to do, and other times like probably didn't do that one as well, and I get the reminder. Yeah, time, the energy make change, and I think it is. That is one of the things is how do you have the time to do the work? Yeah, yeah. For-profit versus nonprofit mentalities. That's a great one. It is a tough one to get your head around sometimes. The nonprofit sector, the way nonprofits work, is not just a sort of modified version of for-profit. There's a fantastic article, let me try and dig it up in the chat, called Through the Looking Glass World of Nonprofit Finance, that compared the realities working in a business with a nonprofit and the different stakeholders, different way money works and stuff. Is quite amazing. All right, I'm gonna move us on from there. Thank you for sharing thoughts. And again, if you want to chat about these things afterwards, we're always around to do that kind of stuff. Just as we go through this, recognize that we're gonna put some theory out there, some thoughts out there, some best practices. But really, what looks good on paper or looks good in a manual somewhere doesn't necessarily reflect the structure, the style, the history, the culture of the board. So there are some fundamentals we probably want to get right. But there's lots of ways to do governance. There's lots of ways to make it fit you. And as we sort of, even as we started with our land acknowledgement, understand different cultures and different ways of being, and different understanding, not just reconciliation, but diversity writ large. There's lots of ways the model can sort of adapt and shift and should shift within that. Because it is a model that is somewhat perhaps dated and doesn't necessarily fit the way the rest of the world works. So take the theory, because there's things we should do, but recognize that you got to build your nonprofit in a way that fits you. And as long as you're not sort of breaking some of the foundational rules, there's lots of room to wiggle here. So take the theory, balance it with your own style, history, and culture of your board and what works for you. So a working board, just to give you a bit of a definition, this is a board where the board members, are actively involved in both the governance and operational tasks. I think I have a challenge with the idea of calling something a governing board and a working board. I'm going to do that anyway, because that's the way things kind of come out of the literature. All boards govern is probably my challenge with that. It's what you do in addition to the governance function that where it gets to that's working board. So traditional boards perhaps focus probably on strategy. They work through policy, they oversee the whole organization. Working boards do both that, and they kind of get their hands-on role and take care of the day-to-day activities, whether that's coordinating that or actually doing that, depending how you structure yourself. So all boards govern. It's how you get the work done that kind of makes this separation, and a whole bunch of grayness in between those places. So just to break it down in kind of the traditional kind of way of thinking, working boards kind of to the left here, governance boards to the right. Again, all boards govern, but we'll call it that for now. Board of directors is always a governance function. That's what boards do, is you govern the organization. What happens next, though, is we start to coordinate the actual work of the organization, the programmatic work, the administrative work, perhaps the funding work, all those things that go into making a nonprofit, is who coordinates that and who does that. We get this layer called management in the middle there. For working boards, maybe the board does that themselves. Maybe they're the ones who do all the work themselves. They govern the work organization and say, they set a work plan, we're going to go do this. In a traditional sort of governance board, you tend to hire a senior executive, and that could be called a CEO, an executive director. In arts organizations, it may have an artistic kind of function to it, general manager. But really the theory is the board hires one person who then employs or supervises staff and volunteers. So that's kind of that hourglass shape for the governance board. The working board has the board governing, and then coordinating the work and then doing the work themselves. So it's the doing of the actual programming, administrative, and maybe fundraising functions that fit in that working board piece. Pretty, there's like some grayness there, but that's the rough definition of these things. A policy board, yeah, I think a policy board in the chat there, and that's what you call a policy board. They enact their will through policy. And doesn't mean that working boards don't have policies, but they have policies and they do the work themselves. So the way a policy board would technically work is you write a policy, and that policy could be something like delegating authority to the executive director. They go do the work. That's another term for policy work. Yeah. I'll get to the other one here in a second. Okay, keep going, Sandeep. So just to pull it apart a bit, again, there'd be lots of variations here. The role working board is involved in governance and operation. A governance board, policy board from the chat there, focus primarily on governance and strategic oversight. And that strategic part's important because all boards need to play that role. So I'll give you a bit more theory at the end here about how to sort of engage folks when you're moving beyond just the sort of to do and the fiduciary stuff. Hands-on involvement for the working board, policy making. We enact our will through policy, strategic planning, and oversight in the governance board. Staffing, working boards may have administrative staff. So you can be a working board and have staff, but they're typically not a senior executive where authority has been given them to run the entire organization sometimes. Whereas governance boards tend to do that. The board hires one employee, would be the language that comes out of governing boards, and they have the authority to run the organization with oversight. So decision-making boards are making both strategic and operational decisions, but in the working board, you're holding much more of those operational roles. I think this is maybe more subjective. I think skills, you get a lot more programmatic knowledge or cause knowledge sometimes in the working board because people want to do something directly. They've come out of that world and want something to happen. Governance boards, again, take this with a grain of salt, can be a little higher level, a little more removed from the cause. Maybe they're not quite as passionate about it. That's maybe not true, but maybe they're not quite as directly involved. So for myself, I sit on a board that's a residential eating disorder facility. Most of the people who started that had lived experience. Their family members came out of that place. We were a working board for a long time. As we've grown up, we brought in new folks who haven't got quite as direct connection to the cause. So things like that perhaps tend to happen in this world. Committees, I mean, sometimes working boards have maybe more for task-oriented committees because we're kind of task-oriented boards. We get things done. Governance boards may be a little more structured, ongoing, staying at that governance level, finance and HR and governance and over planning and those kind of things. I think working boards can be a lot more flexible. If you're smaller, you don't maybe have as many rules or histories or processes, you can be nimble and you can adapt to things. Whereas, sort of more established governance boards, takes a while to change sometimes. And as the bigger the ship gets, the harder it is to turn. And there is a size dynamic here sometimes, usually, but not always. So there are some differences in how we structure, how we make decisions, and perhaps how we enact our work in these two groups. All right, Cindy, off we go. But this is the thing that I think is still missing. This is, I think, work that needs to be done in this sector is sometimes we've taken kind of this model of policy boards and traditional ways of governance and kind of stripped it down a bit and say, well, this should fit a working board. And that's probably not the right way to do it. The working board is not a less sophisticated, it's a more complex beast, I think, to work with sometimes. Partly because the materials aren't there, the theory's not there, I think the resources and support aren't there. But you can't just sort of take something that's designed for a different model and sort of take parts of the way and now it fits. So I think the working board takes more thought and more attention to structure and roles and group processes than perhaps the governance board does. And that's because governance boards tend to have these things quite well established. You've got policies and ways of being that you may not get in the working board things or may not get yet. So it's not just an easier way of doing things. It's probably, there's a complexity there that we still need to get our heads around. And as you go through the growing phases of boards, is to really pay attention to who we are as a board and how we want to do our work, which is challenging, I think, because sometimes when we start organizations, we start a lot of organizations or help a lot of organizations to start here, and we'll walk you through a new program at the end. But people want to get on with doing the work. They want to get on with changing community or serving the clients they want to serve. Fantastic, that's why we're here. The idea, though, we need to spend time in our own house too, and especially, I think, just as much for working boards, where maybe we don't have the traditions and the policies in place. Just some misconceptions out there. I think there are some misconceptions. This is from Stanford Social Innovation. The idea that working boards are only for small nonprofits, not necessarily. I mean, you can grow to I think there comes a time when you're starting to say it's getting too complex. But this isn't just for small startup groups. This isn't just for under $100,000, under $500,000, perhaps. You can quite a ways with these things. There are boards that that raise significant amounts of money, do one or two things a year, maybe just one gal a year, and give money away. And just don't need to grow, don't need to sort of change beyond that. So the idea that it's only small, not necessarily true. The board members should only focus on governance. Well, in working boards, that's not usually true. In policy boards, yes, that's where their weight should be, their thought should be. But as long as it's clearly done, well structured, clear roles, that we know when we're doing operations, when we're doing governance, there is no reason why board members can't be involved in governance. It has to be really, again, thought out, well structured, and well informed. The working boards are temporary. Sometimes that folks say, well, I'm starting out, I'm a working board, and I think all organizations basically start out with a working board. No one usually starts out with incorporating, having an executive director the next day. I haven't seen if it does. But it's not always this idea, these 57%, 16, 17,000, 12,000, whatever it's going to be, the number, not more than that, 14, 15,000 nonprofits in Alberta are all, aspiring to be $100 million nonprofits or $1 million nonprofits. A lot of times we want to grow, but not everybody needs to grow. And it's not the idea that we ever plan to have an executive director or to hire lots of staff to grow. You can do a lot of great things as a small organization. And in fact, that probably is the ecosystem of these new organizations starting every year, is that maybe organizations start up, do work for a while, and off they go, and never get to some sense of scale because that's not their intent, and that's not what necessarily suits their mission. But somehow another misconception maybe that working boards are not as professional. I don't think that's true at all. I think that there are some incredibly well thought out, well structured, well run boards. And it's not that even large boards or policy boards are certainly have all their act together either. I don't think there's a big difference between the two. Or the working boards can't handle complex issues. I would suggest sometimes they are perhaps more able to handle complex issues. They are closer to the ground. One of the things that happens, and one of the pieces we sort of do other board governance is you get this sort of situation where boards have a tough time making decisions because they're so far away. They've delegated all the authority to the senior executive. They're not quite sure where the organization's at. They don't have that connection to the ground. So how do you make strategic decisions? You're all reliant upon what the senior executive tells you or shares with you information. I think working boards, because you have that very tangible and clear direct connection, perhaps can handle more complexity and certainly be nimble in what they do. Some benefits about this, I think there are benefits. But 57% of nonprofits working this way, some great things can happen. I think there is that increased engagement commitment, perhaps, if it's done well. One of the things you get in larger boards is it's hard to maintain that connection to the cause because I'm not doing the direct work. When we're doing the cause, when you've got a working board, you're really connected to it. It's there. It's every day. I can see the tangible efforts of my activities, whereas sometimes in governing boards, that's a little more removed. Again, diverse skill set. I'm going to come in the chat. There is lots of diversity to put these things. And because you're sort of starting out, you're sort of saying who wants to play sometimes, or who's around that are really connected to the cause. I think you have a different lane to recruit from, perhaps. Organizational capacity, because you're doing the work, perhaps there's a way to sort of link some skills that you may not necessarily need on a governance board. Perhaps you've got somebody who's really good at, facility or sort of event management that wants to be on your board as a working board. The governing board, they can oversee or support that role. They may not actually do it. So sometimes you get that capacity that's more direct on a working board. Cost effective. I mean, it's just probably cheaper if you're running a big board and you're gathering folks from people coming from across different geographic areas, perhaps. It may be a little cheaper, not always, but sometimes it may be. And again, flexible and adaptive. I think there is the idea that we can be more responsive to organizational needs and perhaps community needs because we have that greater connection to the cause and to the grassroots. There are challenges, though. I mean, and like anything, there's pros and cons to all these things. There's tensions to all the work we do. Time and resource constraints, it is, running an organization is tough. Governing an organization is tough. To both govern and run an organization is doubly tough by that math. So the idea of, I've got to come and function, do the work of the governing board, and we still got to get stuff done. Well, that is a different beast, right? That's a different way of doing things. purely policy boards or governing boards. I work for a board that is a governing board. They can meet and give me directions, and then off I go until the next meeting or committee meeting. So we do the work as staff. But you're doing both. So that is a lot of pressure to put on folks sometimes to get the work done. That balancing of governing and governance and operational roles, and that's probably the hardest thing, is I've got these sort of multiple hats we wear, we say sometimes in governance and operations. And when am I wearing the hat that says I'm now governing? All boards govern, and governing is different than just doing the work of the organization. So to pull those apart in as clear and sometimes overly clear way as we can is really helpful sometimes. And it's helpful for us as board members to do that, to say, these are the governance things we need to talk about, and these are the operational things we need to talk about. So sometimes using board agendas to do that, governance items, operational items, there's a separation there. Partly it's mindset, partly it's structural pieces going to this. There's probably some role definition, the roles of the board, to be clear about what this is and what it's not. Yeah, so those things, that balancing those two roles. And again, it's time too, right? Because we tend to, and I think smaller nonprofits tend to overshoot their ambitions. We want to do a lot of stuff, and then it's hard to get it done. Largely, sometimes large nonprofits undershoot sometimes. So it's balancing all those roles at the time you have to understand your capacity. So again, maintaining real clear role definition, those kind of things. There's a question in the chat: can a working board elect an officer that functions in the executive role? I would say no. And the reason, what an officer is, essentially the model in board governance is this, and it depends on the act you're under, but Civil Societies Act. The members are going to elect a board. Sometimes the members are the board. We sort of botched some of that along the way. The members elect a board. The board chooses what to do. Officers are specific roles that support the work of the board, the governance function of the board, not the operational function. So a treasurer is a board member, or is somebody who sorts for the board. They don't need to be officers, don't necessarily need to be a part of the board. They can be other folks as well, but they report to and support the board. Board chairs, presidents, secretaries, officers, and a lot of definitions. But the role of an officer is support the governance function. An executive, whatever we call them, supports the execution or operational function. My way of thinking of that one too. So clear role definition, back to those challenges. Make sure we're clear about when I'm governing, who's making decisions, all that kind of stuff. Effective communications. Any boards are probably really important, but for governing boards, sometimes it's easier because we're maybe smaller, or we're sitting in the same room more often, we know each other in the community. Maybe it's easier, but not to assume it, right? Not to assume that we're all making decisions the same way or communicating the same way. And then recruitment retention. And I think that's for any board right now. That's not necessarily big or small. I think recruitment is a challenging thing for this sector, and something we're going to have to sort of figure out as we move forward here. Just a little bit of basics of nonprofit governance for directors. And this doesn't matter if you're, these are director duties. So we'll talk about boards as a whole. We have been. These are individual directors. So I join a board, working board or governing board, doesn't necessarily matter. I have two really fundamental duties. These are the fiduciary duties of nonprofits. These are the things that you need to think about. We need to think about. Anybody who joins a board needs to think about as an individual director joining a board. And these are the two that we tend to use in Alberta: the duty of care, to act with the competence, diligence, the reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise with exercise in comparable circumstances. That's a bit nebulous in my mind because there's a lot of objective words in there, or subjective words in there, sort of, the competence and diligence, what a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge. What it means is you bring the skills and experiences you have, you come prepared to the work. There are things like conflict of interest would fit into this as well, perhaps. The reasonably prudent person kind of roughly breaks down to say, if I'm an accountant on a board and we have a nurse on the board, the level of knowledge and expertise I need to bring on accounting and financial matters is probably a fair bit higher than the nurse. Doesn't mean the nurse doesn't have those skills. It just means that's not necessarily their same experience. And it doesn't mean they're not responsible for the financial aspect. It's just that you bring this individual best you, your best abilities, you come prepared. You don't just show up and say, well, I didn't really know that. And if to say that I didn't know what was going on as a board member, that probably means you're not focusing on your duty of care. And the duty of loyalty is to act with honesty and the good faith in the best interest of the organization. And that's the idea of, you're not just here to support one part of the organization, not just here because I love, this program I do, I don't really care about the rest. I'm not just here to look at the books. We're here to look at the entire organization. We're not here just to support one person or one group. So it's the idea of how do we make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization? That is an individual duty. The challenge, though, is always for all of us is there's not just one course of action that's in the best. Those are not always immediately understandable what the best decision might be. And that's why this collective part becomes really important. Because if I bring in my best and I'm trying to do what's best, and we have well-structured conversations as a collective, then good things happen. If we don't have those places, then we start to fragment a bit and it gets a little more challenging that. So some basic director duties, no matter kind of board you're on, things to follow. For any board, again, so I'm back to the collective again, big or small, to understand and practice good governance. The idea of taking care of our own governance house, to say that we're really good, I think sometimes at saying, let's talk about the programs, talk about the impact we're having, let's talk about finances, let's talk about all kinds of other risk management things. But to attend to our own work as a board is very few boards probably spend enough time on that. Because it doesn't seem like it's directly applicable. I should be focusing on doing all the other good things. But to spend that time on good governance is really important. You're focusing on long-term sustainability. And for working boards, that's probably a little more challenging because we're sort of heads down. We're kind of doing the day-to-day work. We've got to lift them up every now and then and sort of think, okay, what's happening 1, 2, 3, 5 years down the road? And that's tougher if you're doing both and I think for governing boards, it makes it a little easier because you're not really tasked with doing that day-to-day work, and maybe you can lift your eyes a little easier. Being clear about that relationship between governance and programmatic administrative work for a working board for sure. So again, that role clarity, where am I wearing which hat, for myself and for others to know that I'm talking about things as a governor, and other times I'm talking about things as a volunteer doing the program work. Policies for any board doesn't matter. For governing boards, probably a little more, perhaps more developed, but every board needs some policy for continuity, for clarity. Again, it's a way of a board expressing its will and making sure again that everyone's on the same page, perhaps. Boards and more big or small, probably more direct, certainly in working boards, but the idea that you're responsible for your recruitment and development. Who's going to sort of make sure that we've got people on board and recruited, all those kind of good things. We're all ambassadors for our organization. This is one thing that working boards do really well. You're there doing the work and you're very clearly an ambassador. And I think that governing boards tend to move in and out of that a bit too much. So the idea that a voice of board members speaking for organization is so powerful. It's the group that is there because they're volunteers. I can speak for Integral Board, but I get paid by Integral Board. Doesn't mean I don't care about it. Doesn't mean that I'm not passionate about it. It's different when my board chair speaks about what we do. So that ambassador role, super important for any organization. Again, focusing the whole organization, not just the things that I like that I'm good at. Sometimes I got to focus on things I'm not so good at. And we speak together with one voice. This is the one, again, that is very clearly, any size board, you have one voice. Inside the boardroom, around the boardroom table, you can fight it out tooth and nail. You can say, we disagree, we got all kinds of things to work through. When you leave that board table, you're speaking with one voice to your volunteers, to the community members, to funders, if you have staff, doesn't matter. That's one of my board members, a very experienced board member, says we speak with one voice, we don't speak at all. And that's hard because I think, the idea that sometimes you want to say, well, I'm not really aligned with that one. Inside the board, fair enough. Outside the board, it is one voice. If we're going to transition, and again, not everyone wants to transition to being a governing board, but there are some things to think about along the way. It can be a tough one it's a tough one to navigate. And for anybody, it's a tough one to navigate. I've been on this place. I've started organizations and sort of grown them up. I work for an organization that does this. Those growing pains can be quite significant and quite challenged to work your way through. And it's not just a change in the size or a change in the financing of the organization. It's a change in kind of the DNA of the organization. We're no longer a group of 5 or 8 people doing everything ourselves. We're kind of moving ourselves away from the operations and bringing in this other players. And that's a tough one sometimes. So the leap is a little tricky. It does come with a lot of groups who are saying, I want to hire an executive director. That's kind of one of the traditional first steps. But that comes with an ongoing financial sustainability piece that's trickier, right? So to say, even if you're going part-time, that leap from no staff to a senior staff is a pretty big leap, and it's there for the foreseeable future. You probably don't want to go down this path unless you say, I can actually fund this for the next 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. A lot of times you see people coming off the board being that first executive director. That's fair enough. But again, you're really changing that role. Like it used to be one of us, and now it is somebody I work for. So that's a bit of a change too. The shift from being sort of hands-on to hands-off. It doesn't have to happen overnight. There's a lot of transition time in this. You can structure these things where it's not just working board, governance board, and you jump overnight. You probably should structure and take your time to do it. But the idea that we used to do it all, I used to be involved in everything, I used to know more what's going on, I used to feel more fulfilled because I was doing stuff as well. That's a tough one. You start to get that idea of sort of, noses in, fingers out, or hands off, or hands in, whatever. The idea that that's a tough jump to make. And it takes a bit of maturity as a board to go through that and some grieving perhaps, because sometimes it's a lot funner to do the work than it is to do the governance pieces as well. Again, that shift in culture where we're doing this as a working board, doing it all together. But now we've got this thing called an employee. Maybe it's somebody we've known for a long time. And now we're going to sort of think about, I'm your boss. And that changes relationships. And that can change personal relationships, organizational relationships. So really thinking that through in advance, being really clear and really candid, I think, about what this relationship might do. It's likely the best thing. Usually you have somebody who says, I want to do the work and willing to take the time and probably do it for not much money to start with. But again, not to assume this is going to be the same as it was before, because the relationship has fundamentally changed. One of the things that challenges boards though most in this world is that is when we sort of lose that doing it all. You sort of think, well, what's my job then? What is my job as a board member? I used to be really busy doing stuff as we were governing and doing all the work, and now I'm not doing all the work anymore, and I'm just left with this thing called governing. And it's rethinking governance or moving more fully into governance pieces, perhaps, than sometimes working boards get the chance to do. And there's this body of knowledge, go ahead now, Sandeep, called Governance is Leadership. And this is a book that probably came out 15 years ago. And it acknowledged that a lot of the work of boards is at fiduciary level, that taking care of making sure we manage risk and run the organization well, oversee the organization's operations well. Maybe it is some fundraising. It's getting things done. So that stewardship of assets, as they say. And that's where a lot of the thought on board governance was, is saying, we'll just do the fiduciary stuff, we're fine. It ignored two other really clear functions, the strategic part of being a board. Board members, as you grow up, and no matter the size of the board, there still is a strategic element to any board governance. So that partnerships with management, perhaps, or other stakeholders, to think out where are we going in the next 1, 2, 3 years. Those are really good roles for the board, and those are quite often shared roles between boards and management, but any board needs to do that. Then the third role, and this gets a little more abstract, and for some folks it's a little uncomfortable because it's kind of the what if kind of role. It's called generative governance. It's that sense making for the future, that idea of saying, okay, we've attended today really well on the fiduciary side. We've got some strategies for the next few years. This generative stuff is kind of that blue sky thinking, perhaps, or maybe it's not even blue sky, maybe it's black sky because there's clouds out there. What's going to happen down the road? What's the nature of this world we're working in down the road? So if we're working perhaps with children's agencies right now, the demographics on children's serving agencies are not the same as senior serving agencies. Big growth in seniors care in the next 10 years, that's going to drive a lot of different change in community. Maybe less growth, and who knows these days. But you start to think about what the world might look like. And it's not just a sort of abstract exercise. It prepares us for things when they happen. So, there's a body of work in scenario planning, perhaps, saying that, what happens if the markets all melted down and we lost 50% of our assets overnight? That'll never happen. Well, sometimes it does. Good to have sort of what if conversations every now and then. They are important to sort of drive back the sense-making parts of the challenge sometimes, but can be done. So boards have different roles beyond the fiduciary, and as you grow and transition, to add some of these other roles and that sort of think through what might happen in different situations. End of the day, this is a team activity. Governance at any board is very much a team activity. You are a collective, and that idea of forming like a team is super important. So we tend to think through this with groups, big and small, in a couple different areas, 3 different areas. It's sort of the structure, the people on the board, the processes, and maybe the performance issues. So I'll just touch on a few things. This probably is more for any board, perhaps, I think. Again, we got a good mix today on this call. So, but again, the way they play out, you're going to weight them in certain ways. So firstly, teamwork. There you go, Andrew Carnegie, the 5-person bike. be thoughtful about recruiting to a board. When you're getting people on the board, think through that you're really clear what this is the kind of board we are. It does you no good if somebody get on the board and think, oh, I didn't know you didn't have a staff member, or I didn't know we're doing all the work yourself. So that upfront, be thoughtful, not just the structure of the board, but to say, this is who we want on the board. It's not just somebody putting up their hands. It's not about getting a bum in a seat. It's about saying, I want somebody who's really about us in the way that we want to do things that fits us. And I think fit on boards is something that's hard to get sometimes. When it works really well, it's magic. When it doesn't, then things tend to fall apart. Making sure when folks get there that you've equipped them well. So orientation, whatever that looks like, can be quite simple sometimes. You don't have to make complexities. It can be more well thought out. It's not a one and done thing though. Sometimes I think we'll do a board orientation for an hour and then you're good. Not really. It's that idea of constantly equipping your board with the fundamentals of governance. And one of the things in the chat was, I don't know we all have the same understanding of governance. I think boards need to do a governance orientation every year because the idea, I might know some things, but unless we have this common understanding, it doesn't get us too far. So we do board orientations for larger boards sometimes yearly, and it's a lot of them hear the same thing over and over again, but they have to wrestle with that with new board members. That constantly equipping ourselves is really important. How to align people's interests and skills with their own interests. That's one thing that's important. I think working boards have more of an advantage saying, I've got some skills, I've got some energy to do something a certain way. Can I get it done? There's sometimes a little more of a break on that with governance boards. It's saying my interests may well align more with operational areas, and so I can't use those things. And I'm a CEO, but I'm also on a board who has an executive director, and I need to be quite careful saying, I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. I'm here to be a governor. I'm going to bite my tongue on things, mostly because she does things a lot better than I do. So we do have to sort of recognize that the skills and interests we may have may not align with the organization's needs as well. And then how we structure the board too. If you're smaller or perhaps more nimble, more basic in your operations, keep it a very basic structure. Maybe you don't need a lot of committees. The size of the board, the structure of the board, frequency of meetings. Make sure your structure fits not just what you think you want to do, but what you really have the capacity to do today. So don't build out. Remember, I joined a board once and it had, I think maybe a dozen board members and had 13 committees. You kind of do the math in your head going, holy smokes, that's a lot of committees to be on. But it needed to be sort of pared down. So we went through and helped them pare that down. So the idea of make sure your structure fits not just what you want to do or what you think you want to do, the actual capacity and needs of the board as well. Processes, any board needs to sort of establish processes. I think creating those places for meaningful participation from all board members, that's kind of the art of governing, the art of conversation, open debate, questioning, atmosphere of trust and respect, whether it extends to an executive director or not, if you have such a role. But the idea of how do we create a really rich place of dialogue, and we're making sure all opinions are on the table. And sometimes for folks, it's easy to throw their ideas out there. Other folks are quite quiet about that. And sometimes the loudest voices get heard, they're not necessarily the best voices. So the idea of creating a healthy culture, again, big or small, a fundamental one. Be clear about decision-making processes. Sometimes that's easier in governance boards. You have it as bait, goes to the executive director to carry it out. In smaller boards or working boards, sometimes the idea of who's going to do what, how are we going to make decisions? Is this consensus? When we're doing operational things, are we giving away some authority to make operational decisions? You probably don't, if you got a board who's doing the working board model, you don't need to have every board member weigh in on what color of photocopier paper we need or those kind of things. So where decisions are being made, some of those being given to individuals or committees, but being clear about it again. So again, where decisions the board has to make and where it's sort of given some away. In governance boards, that's usually quite formal through a delegation of authority policy. In working boards, you probably need some other ways of clarifying those things. And being clear, oh, sorry, that's good. Clear expectations, performance. There is the idea, one of the questions that came up in the chat about, how do you, where do you understand the weaknesses and strengths of your board? And I think any board, as a developmental tool, should do a board evaluation. And so this can be kind of a fancy thing. We do them for boards. They're not super expensive. They're probably fine. There's online ones you can probably find. But it's just a way for individual board members and the board as collective to say, how are we doing? Are we getting the right information? Are we structuring ourselves well? Are we having good conversations? Whatever it might be, those tools to sort of make sure we stay focused on that board development. So some other process things, perhaps, I think the idea of clear expectations, again, that we're clear about what we want from each other, kind of a foundational thing. Stick at times in working boards, maybe this can be challenging because we mixed everything together. So perhaps using an agenda on a working board to say, these are the governance questions we're going to have, these are the operational ones, being really clear and pulling those apart. So we've got a real clear understanding of when we're doing this work and when we're doing this work. And I just think the idea of creating social time on the board, it's this unique and curious structure we have in governance. The idea that, we can just sort of put people in a room together and we can go through a really clear and well-run agenda and run a really perfect meeting. And there's no energy, there's no trust, there's no connectivity, there's no understanding. And I think that idea of creating time together for a board to just be people together goes a long, long way. I know time's sometimes limited, but that is a pretty good investment in any board I've been on. The board I'm on, one of the boards I'm on, has almost no policies, but is a really high functioning board because of this, the trust we managed to engender amongst the board, and some of that social, a lot of it's business. But that culture piece can go a long way, and that culture, if that's not right, doesn't matter your processes, your policies, your structure, you're not going to go too far. And I know we're at. Questions. See, first time doing a workshop like this one, you never really know where things are going to go, or how long it's going to take. So any questions that we haven't answered, I've sort of tried to throw some in and made up others along the way. But any questions you have, you can sort of speak them out or type them in. Again, we may hang around afterwards. You want to ask questions that are more specific to your situation, or maybe you don't want to share with everybody else. And again, we can always do this offline too as well. But if you have any questions, let us know. If not, we'll keep going here. So. I'm just going to take the silence in the chat. I mean, Mike, you covered everything as perfectly as you possibly could. There's no other question that could ever possibly be asked. Oh, hang on. Email. Yeah, I can't answer that one. So Sandeep will give you that one. So
yep.
There we go. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Sandeep. And if there's questions at the end here, I'll come back to it. We got time. But Sandeep, maybe I'll just give it to you to sort of walk us through kind of a new offering, a way of helping groups that are probably smaller starting out, but not necessarily. With what we do. And there's other ways as well. Oh, here, this too. Yep. Just I'll do this one. There's some great resources out there. And if you're looking to say, where can I find stuff? Just send us an email. It'll pop up somewhere here. And we'll find some stuff for you. Managing Canada Standards. The Managing Canada Standards is an accreditation program for nonprofits. You may not choose to pay the accreditation fee, but you get the materials and ask you the questions. And it breaks it down to things like governance and HR perhaps, or financial stuff. A nice little toolkit to have, just ask yourself some questions. Again, you don't need to do the accreditation. You can kind of get the questions and areas to build upon in order to help structure the stuff. The board development program was out of the community development unit of the Alberta government. They run some great workshops. We got all kinds of workshops on this too. They got some great print resources too. Alberta Made, which is really nice because it's Societies Act, and that's kind of good. You want to make sure that get to more technical stuff, make sure it fits with your act. Don't just copy and paste something from New Jersey or something like that. Again, the Chartered Professional Accounts of Canada, lots of great materials there on risk, on social enterprise, on governance in general, financial stuff, really good materials, accessible, free to use. And then Board Source. Board Source is an American product, so take the regulatory pieces, the policy pieces, a bit of grain of salt. But in terms of board processes, how to build a board, how to have conversations, some role things like that, I find them quite interesting and easy to use. Yeah. A couple more questions here. So, how, as a governing board, you handle a situation the ED is making that add more work to staff and aren't best practices? That's a tricky one, right? This is the one where it's tricky because you've given away a lot of the authority to the ED, and to say that if they're doing things that do not meet your performance expectations, then that's a performance conversation. So it may be through policy, like the delegation of authority, and there may be more operational things. It's tough because you don't necessarily want staff coming directly to the board, but you've lost this thing. So that may be one we can sort of handle offline a bit more, but that is a challenge. So things like policy and delegation, maybe, performance reviews that involve feedback from the staff that's anonymous. That's harder to do sometimes to get sort of direct stuff. So I think there's performance systems, performance monitoring systems that might help with that. What do you do when one director is suddenly flip sides to be against you? Yeah. It is tough. I mean, because there should be no sides in nonprofits. You are a collective, right? The board should be speaking as one, but you get people who have very strong opinions. And that is where the idea of speaking as a collective, having processes, a lot of that happen. It does come down to leadership sometimes, the role of the chair, perhaps sometimes in these ones. To say that the chair's role is not usually anybody who has any more authority, but it's somebody's got to sort of quarterback this group of a board. And there's a director that's maybe pushing back on things inappropriately. Then it's not the best answer sometimes, but sometimes you got to put more structure and policy in place, which sounds wrong, but well, it doesn't sound wrong. It just sounds dry, perhaps. The idea that, let's make more rules. If we have more rules, then we'll all get along. Probably not. But if you have rules, at least you know what the rules of engagement are, and then we can see if we're following them or not. So there's a cultural piece of that, maybe there's a structural piece, and maybe a leadership piece. Again, super quick answer, not quite knowing the situation. I'm going to turn it to Sandeep for a second. Again, if you want to hang around at the end and just chat, I'm happy to do that. But Sandeep, why don't you give us some thoughts on other ways to help folks?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. All right, folks, we would like to take a second to talk about our latest program offering, the Nonprofit Evolution Lab. The lab is designed for emerging nonprofits in Alberta, where we cover topics like getting started, your first strategic plan, governance, and funding and financing. The lab offers the flexibility of self-paced learning while being supported with tools like an organizational development plan and coaching from subject matter experts. Delivered online, this program gives you the most current and relevant information that you need to make strong decisions about the next steps when it comes to your nonprofit initiative. We've identified various organizational areas to develop, clarified complex processes, and bridged knowledge gaps so that you can make strategic progress. This intentional but flexible path forward will help you avoid setbacks later where missing or incomplete steps can be time-consuming and costly. The lab offers accessible resources like toolkits, checklists, assessments, and videos that reflect the most current relevant information to the Alberta nonprofit context, and has tools like the organizational development plan that will capture your priorities and help you get clear on next steps. All of this is supported by expert guidance where all of your questions will be answered along the way, and it will ensure that you remain on the right track. Share a little bit of an overview. I'm going to share a link to the Nonprofit Evolution Lab webpage in a moment here, but this overview is what you can expect if you are interested or would like to learn some more. So the webpage will have some more details for you, as well as our contact information to get in touch, and also a link to an inquiry form. So this inquiry form is just a way for us to better understand what your needs, interests are, and where you are in your nonprofit development journey. And once we receive this form, we will connect with you to chat a little bit further about your goals and any of the questions that you may have. From there, modules in the lab do have a fee attached to them, but we're open to chatting about that as well. Our aim is to make this program as accessible as possible, so please don't let that be a barrier. By completing the form and chatting with us, we can figure out a plan to move forward that makes sense for you. And at that time, if the lab is feeling like this is something you want to participate in and will benefit from, we can move on to an enrollment process, which is basically the administrative portion of getting things going. We'll set up your account. And again, the option for multiple folks to participate from your organization is also a part of our model here. And so by signing up, you're not just signing up for yourself, but you will have access for up to 3 other people from your nonprofit group who can also go on this learning and development journey with you. And this is part of the design just to ensure that the alignment amongst your group is also created and worked into your development plan and how you're moving forward. We are taking inquiries for the lab ongoing. It's an ongoing kind of process and enter at any point, but we will run our first kind of live session of this starting later this month. So we're hoping to be rolling. April 22nd is the date that we have in mind. I'm going to drop some more information now. Okay. So This is the webpage to the lab where you can find a lot more information. The contact information for myself is shared here as well. And so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. In the meantime, you'll also have a link to the information session and a demo that can be found on the website. This kind of gives you a little bit more of a in-depth view of what you can expect by participating in the lab. Okay, so there was a resource slide that Mike walked you through a few moments ago that will be included in the package that you will receive after today's session. But that is all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that the session was informative and relevant to your nonprofit needs and interests. Mike's mentioned a couple of times if there's something else that hasn't been discussed yet or you'd like to chat further, please feel free to reach out to us. This is what we do, so we're happy to have a conversation with you and your nonprofit organization.
Thanks,
If you have,
folks. Thanks for joining us, and hope to keep chatting with you soon
yeah,
or whenever. Yeah.
yeah, whenever. If you have a few moments to spare, I have dropped a link to a evaluation or a feedback survey for today's session. This just helps us know that we're on track and the way that we're engaging and bringing information to you folks is what is meeting your interests and needs and education kind of interests, I guess. That would be appreciated. Again, here's a little bit more about what our supports and services look like. So an in-depth conversation about your nonprofit organization can look like one of our free problem-solving services. This is a short phone call or video consultation or a one-hour problem-solving session called a clinic. These meetings happen between our team and your team and involve a subject matter expert who can walk you through any of your questions. Clinics and consultations are a part of our mission to educate and support Alberta nonprofits. So we're here to help. You can find out more by visiting our website here or by giving us a call. Integral Org is a capacity builder and nonprofit ourselves, and our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and support that you need to do your best work. We work in many core areas, including governance, strategic planning, risk management, legal compliance, financial management, leadership development, and more. We work with nonprofits at any stage of their life cycle using a multidisciplinary approach to address your most pressing concerns. We're here to walk alongside your nonprofit development journey, so give us a call. Thanks again for joining us today, everyone.
Now we're really done. So we sort of done before, but now we're done.
Yeah.
So, but let's want to hang around. So there we go.
Now we're
Yeah.
done.
Okay. Thanks, folks. Yep.